Thank you, Linda. That's fantastic. Yes, I'm delighted to be working with these amazing colleagues. So we have Anna, who has already been mentioned by Linda. We have Dr. Deagon from Central Queensland University and Sarah McManus, who's a PhD student who's working in this field and specifically looking at food literacy and sustainability, and that circle around, out of field teaching. So it's a really nice connection. In this presentation, we're going to focus on the perceptions of in-field and out-of-field home economics teachers on their effectiveness and on self-efficacy of out-of-field teachers. So it's a really specific thing. But we're going to start, and then what are the impacts and implications and mitigation strategies? I'm going to start big though and share with you a little bit about the overall study, just to give you a sense of it. The abstract you will have seen, but what wasn't in that abstract, and I've slightly updated it, was that we started with 469 people participating in this. And so it was a reasonable size, and then we've narrowed it down to reporting in this particular presentation today on 194 Australian responses, but I'll come back to that. We've used Anna's definition of out-of-field teachers and what that means. So we've used that to frame the work. And the three people who you've seen alongside Anna there, so myself and Jay and Sarah, have a background in home economics education. So we're either teachers or we're home economics educators or combinations of both. And so we've got quite extensive experience in this field. Home economics is a really interesting area because it's not necessarily known as home economics anywhere. There are no subjects necessarily that are called home economics, but they're called things like, health, technology, textiles, fashion, hospitality. But the umbrella in terms of teacher education is around home economics, and historically around 100 years it's existed as a field. In Australia, about a quarter of our teachers are out of field, but it's higher in some of these areas where home economics exists, and it's about 40%, for example, in that technology area. So we know that there's likely to be a lot of out-of-field teaching in home economics, but there hasn't been any research undertaken. And so this was our challenge, because nobody is doing specific work in this area that there are for you, but it tends to be very, very small. And so we wanted to know what's going on in this field. Is it an issue that's worth pursuing? What does it look like? What are the challenges with retention, et cetera, et cetera? And we're working on the assumption that self-efficacy is one of those key measures when you look at in-field and out-of-field teachers in terms of their pedagogical content knowledge and then their professional identity work. So the sorts of things I heard in the presentations earlier today. So we wanted to look at similarities and differences of perceptions of teachers' beliefs on their effectiveness in that student learning of out-of-field teaching. The approach that we took was quite extensive. We began with a systematic quantitative literature review that's been published. That SQLR provides us with insights globally around what is known about out-of-field teaching in the field. And then we conducted a survey, which was using snowballing to recruit. And then we went through a data analysis process in a range of different ways, because we had both quantitative and qualitative data. Our quantitative data, we've used all sorts of stats on it, and then we've used thematic content analysis of free text and used Lexamancer as a base for that. What we wanted to do was to understand the field a bit more, to see if this was a challenge for the field that really aligned with the anecdotes that we kept being told. And so we're looking for some sort of evidence. So the systematic quantitative literature review, we were able to find 25 articles around the world. So this is conducted in 2022. It's been a longitudinal process to do all of this work. And we were interested in the country of research origin, how, there's quite some work that's been happened in certain countries, including Australia. There's probably some of the most work. That's probably the three of us, to be honest, who've been working in the area previously and published in related areas, who've been raising the challenges. But the United States also stood out there as having done some work. And then you'll see there's Sweden and Slovenia. So quite diverse. our inclusion criteria was around, it had to be research. It had to be research. It was not simply opinion-based, and it needed to tell us something that was related specifically to home economics or the field. 80% of the publications of those 25 were not exclusive to the field, but they included it in some way. And so 12% kind of were more specific to the field. And you'll see they're the sorts of things that we found. The reasons for out of field globally are identified there. Budget was number one. So not enough teachers, have to have someone, let's whack someone we've got in front of a class. Number two, again, same thing, fill out the time that teachers have available, and there are just no specialist teachers available to do it. So what we found was when people gave reasons as to in this literature about teaching out of field, it was often people like, oh, I like cooking, I'll take this on, I'll teach it. Or, you're a mum, you can do it. Or, this kind of thing. And so, and this evidence within these papers that this is the way in which areas associated with home economics have been filled. So quite often, absolutely no field knowledge at all. The consequences that we extracted, and we created those categories down there, you would all recognise the sorts of similar patterns across the literature. And these kind of impacts, if you like. And so, of course, this stimulated us to want to know more. And hence we headed into the next part of our study fairly well armed with understanding the field. There were three areas that really stood out about the consequences on students, on the subject itself, and on teacher impacts. And with home economics, it's this very interesting kind of confirmatory cycle where a shortage of teachers leads to there not being any teachers available, leads to students not being interested in the field, leads to no teachers. And so it has its own unique kind of, and I like the fact that heterogeneity was mentioned in the earlier session, because I think it has a few things happening that are a little unique because of the nature of the field itself. And so I won't go into that, but you can get a bit of a sense there. There were 14 countries that were involved in the survey. So this is the survey data that I mentioned that we administered online, digital, snowballing, 469 responses. Have a scan, you can see that lots of the people who were employed were experienced teachers, they're on permanent employment. They'd had a range of different years teaching, and we got people from around the world who were interested in responding to this. The demographics in terms of female-male distribution pretty much reflects the teaching population, so it gives us a little bit of a sense of this. And 87% of them were actually in field, and the remainder were out of field who responded at this first level. So we knew that we had a fairly interesting set of people who were giving us responses to the survey that was built out of that systematic quantitative lit review. The biggest cohort was Australian respondents, nothing to be too surprised about there, given that we're all from Australia, all the researchers, and the snowballing within Australia was very effective. So we decided to now look more closely at the Australian data. In other publications, we've shared the global story as well. And so that's now available in the literature. This is yet to be published in full, and hence we're sort of sharing this a little bit more to make it more accessible. And again, you can see that our mix of male to female, roughly representative of the population. And there were more out of field teachers who responded than the global representative group, and the in-field home economics teachers were about 83%. So a nice blend, and we were able to ask people questions about perceptions, self-efficacy, challenges, impacts, etc. So lots of years teaching, of course, but also some very fresh faces. About, a large proportion, about a quarter, had only been teaching for 1 to 5 years. So remember at the beginning, we said we were wanting to look at the perceptions of out-of-field teachers that are held by both in-field teachers and out-of-field teachers themselves, and do a bit of a comparison around these perceptions. And these are some of the things that we compared. So we looked at teaching effectiveness, and we used rating scales here. So people reported on scales, and we were able to determine the significance of these. So in-field teachers believe that they're more effective teaching than out-of-field teachers. Out-of-field teachers don't agree necessarily that in-field teachers are more effective at teaching than they are. The assessment effectiveness, in-field teachers disagree that out-of-field teachers could assess using appropriate assessment practices compared to them, whereas out-of-field teachers believe their assessment practices were fine. Student performance impacts, in-field teachers believe that they perform better when taught by home ec teachers, and out-of-field teachers believe that students perform well when they're taught by out-of-field. So there was a strong perception by the out-of-field teachers that they were doing quite a good job in terms of the teaching that was occurring. In terms of self-efficacy, and also we looked at belonging in this one, teaching and confidence and competence was higher when teaching in field. And so this was a question that we also asked in-field teachers when they were teaching out of field, if that makes sense. And that would have been not in a home economics subject. So they also said that when they were asked to teach out of field, that their confidence and competence diminishes. Their sense of belonging is higher when they're teaching in field. Now, sense of belonging is one of those critical areas in Australia. We're starting to understand more the importance of sense of belonging as a professional wellbeing measure. And so if you feel a sense of belonging and connectedness within your teaching groups and subjects, etc., then you're more likely to stay. So we're seeing the relationship between those things develop even stronger. And of course, in-field teachers are more confident and competent when they're teaching in field. So a really nice set of data around that. We asked them, do you have something else that you want to add about the effectiveness of when you're teaching out of field? And there's a whole lot of comments that we're able to group using Lexamancer and then convert into themes. And so there are 4 themes that we created. We've also got the Lexamancer map there for you to have a look at some of the words, some of the sort of terminology that started to appear to form these kind of collections of themes and ideas. So if we look at the theme of depth of knowledge, there's quite a bit of commentary around this, and the comments were, of course, that out-of-field teachers don't have the deep knowledge, and so that was reported, and that but that they can develop it. So there was a sense that this is not an insolvable aspect. With respect to the teachers themselves, what we found with respect to out-of-field was that they were feeling overwhelmed, they had low confidence, and they felt inexperienced. The student impacts were also that the students preferred teachers who were in field. Now, this is teachers reporting this, remember, not the students. So this is their perception. And in-field teachers also told us that it was time consuming to support out-of-field teachers. And this was using resources and development time that exhausted them. And some of the quotes that we've got around that are quite impactful. Now, the reason why we highlight that one, and then I'll move over to the theme of skills, is because home economics has practical aspects to it. It does require the running of what we call laboratories, which could be kitchens, they could be design studios, they could be sewing laboratories where you're designing costumery, whatever it happens to be. And if you have people working in those areas that might have some experience due to hobby, or they might have, they cook their own meals, that doesn't translate into teaching food-related skills associated with the field, but it's assumed that it does. And so that translation is a real barrier, and in-field teachers are telling us they spend a lot of time being concerned about that. And so we moved across to the theme of skills, and a lot of people spoke about this and highlighted that that it is an area where practical skills matter. And what we saw was that there was a lot of failure to address those skills. So people who are not feeling confident would simply not do that. And so the students wouldn't get the applications, they wouldn't develop the skills and capabilities in order to be able to apply nutrition knowledge or whatever the case may be, food literacy knowledge. The second part of that theme around skills is very new in this area, and we found the safety issues to be really critical for managing risks and hazards. And we had stories about, people who'd been injured, who were working out of field in our laboratories and were injured. Students were injured because of not having the safety procedures in place. And that was quite scary to see that. And the fourth theme was around having the passion and support and the experience in order to be effective, and that, having personal experience wasn't enough to carry you through, and passion and interest in the area, not enough when you don't have the specialist skills. So some of the potential implications that we started to look at, if you then translate those into overall effects on the profession, was that there's a difference in beliefs between the in-field teachers and out-of-field teachers around their effectiveness. So that gap in beliefs. The second was around self-efficacy, and both in-field and out-of-field home economics teachers reported that when they're teaching out-of-field, their efficacy decreases, but in-field home economics teachers thought that out-of-field home economics teachers were less self-efficacious compared to what out-of-field teachers believed they were. Thirdly, the emotional well-being of the teachers was impacted in terms of having to do that extra work and support. And finally, the limited PCK, especially related to the practical aspects, safety skills and knowledge. And the implications for that are then, you can see a whole lot of things there falling out in terms of implications on teachers, students in the subject area, some of which I've already mentioned. We saw shadows of in the early literature review, but not really any in-depth knowledge. And so we're able to put a bit of meat on the bones to some of that early literature that pushed towards this, but now we've got some really strong evidence about that, what it means for students and the lack of opportunities to do the practice-based work, and the teachers likewise to bring those skill sets to life. So how does this, I guess, apply globally? As I started talking about, we've got a global data set, and our next piece of work is actually looking to see how many of these countries have got enough data to explore at this level of depth with the data that's available from those areas. But we know that in terms of the Australian environment, that it's leading to these sorts of, in the classroom, if you like, in the staff room issues. And that was a question that was asked from me when I presented this somewhere else. What does this mean, with teachers in the classroom, with teachers actually turning up, and how is this creating an environment, a collegial environment where sense of belonging is a critical issue? And if we look at the teaching team culture impacts, we're actually seeing that both in-field and out-of-field teachers are resistant to creating this sense of belonging and taking out-of-field teachers under their wing to develop capabilities where they're needed. Out-of-field teachers reported feeling that there are lots of negative impacts on their professional and emotional well-being because they felt incapable to do some of the work that they're being asked to do. The classroom safety one I've already highlighted to an extent. But we believe that this is a really significant and quite unusual aspect, but we're certainly not alone. There's lots of areas that have unique environments that have certain risk and safety attached to them. And the concerns about teacher self-efficacy overall, that we're in an environment where we have a shortage of teachers. So if we're creating situations where we diminish teacher self-efficacy, it's likely to lead to absenteeism, presenteeism, diminished well-being. And we've seen that in terms of workload, that these environments where teachers are not feeling well equipped leads to greater workload outcomes, which then leads to professional wellbeing challenges. Some strategies that were identified, and these are not our strategies, these are the respondent strategies. And we thought that was really important because these are people who are, of course, working in the field and wanting to make it work. And so they provided these sorts of strategies for us. And, you know, these are strategies that I think reflect what we know within the field. The safety training is probably the unique extra bit. And it feels like that would be achievable, that, you know, you would be able to do specific work in this area and quite targeted to develop those capabilities. So we thought that that was something that could happen, and it could actually, it's that Dunning-Kruger effect, isn't it? It actually opens the door. So when you see what you don't know, you can suddenly then identify those things and start to do something about it. But what we also found was that quite often the out-of-field teachers, particularly in the practice areas and the safety, didn't know that they didn't have skills in those areas. So they weren't even able to identify this as a challenge until they got there, and there were issues then that started to really make them feel uncomfortable. So some concluding thoughts. Before we started this study, there was really no shared understanding of out-of-field teaching across the globe in home economics. There was a problem, there was a challenge, but nobody really knew about this whole phenomena. It was just talked about as, you know, somebody teaching who doesn't have skills. And so we've introduced the whole area to the field, and that's been really valuable. And the International Federation for Home Economics, which is a global organisation with thousands of, you can imagine, reach around the world, and is really the kind of peak body, has taken on board this language and is starting to identify some of these challenges, which doesn't exist everywhere, can I say, because of course some countries really control and manage teacher education to ensure that the balance is right. But we're sharing this global language in the home economics field for the first time, and it's been really, I think, empowering to the field to use this language. We know a lot more about the phenomena than we've ever known before, and our work is now around looking to work on these applications, implications, strategies to reform. So it's really important for home economics educational policy, and we're thrilled to be learning from many of the people in the room today who have been leading this field. So on that note, I'll stop sharing and open the screen again.